You think they don't care, don't you? You think their silence means they've already moved on. But what if I told you the exact opposite is true? What if the one behavior that's breaking your heart is actually the sign they've already fallen for you? Let's get real. Dating an avoidant can feel like emotional whiplash. One minute they're all in. The next, they're pulling away so fast it feels like you imagined the whole connection. And in those quiet moments when texts stop and affection fades, your brain spirals. But here's what no one tells you. Avoidance isn't always a sign of detachment. Sometimes it's the clearest sign of emotional attachment. I'm going to show you 6 specific behaviors that look like distance, coldness, or disinterest, but are actually powerful, unintentional signals that an avoidant has already fallen in love with you. So before you chase, before you walk away, before you blame yourself for loving too hard, you need to hear this. Watch until the end, because by the final point, you're going to see your entire relationship differently. When you're with an avoidant partner, you'll start to notice a pattern that feels like emotional sabotage. Things are going well, better than ever. You've had a beautiful weekend together. They looked at you like you were the only person in the room. They let their guard down. They opened up about their past, maybe even shared stories they've never told anyone before. You felt the shift. You felt their heart. The moment was deep, real, and intimate. And then, like clockwork, they vanished. The texts slowed down. They stopped initiating. Their energy shifted, and you're left staring at your phone, spiraling with questions. Did I say something wrong? Were they faking it? How can someone go from being so present to completely distant in just a matter of hours? The confusion is brutal, but here's the truth that very few people understand. When an avoidant disappears right after a moment of deep emotional connection, it's not because they didn't feel what you felt. It's because they did. You see, avoidantly attached individuals have a nervous system that's been wired, usually from early childhood, to equate emotional closeness with danger. For them, intimacy isn't a warm and fuzzy experience. It feels like a threat. It triggers the deeply rooted belief that if they get too close, they'll be engulfed, smothered, or lose themselves. So when you connect with them deeply, their system goes into alert mode. They don't consciously think, I need to get away from this person. What happens is even more frustrating. They suddenly feel a surge of anxiety they can't explain. Their body tightens. Their mind starts racing. Their instinct kicks in and tells them, run. And that's what they do, not because they don't care, but because they care more than they know how to handle. Now, to the person on the receiving end, you, this reaction feels like betrayal. You shared something sacred. You felt seen and heard and loved. And now, their distance makes it feel like all of that was a lie. But that's the trap. That's the lens of your own attachment wounds interpreting their defense mechanisms. What's really happening is they're overwhelmed. Vulnerability for them isn't liberating. It's destabilizing. When they disappear after connection, they're not ghosting you in the traditional sense. They're retreating into the only space that feels safe, solitude. It's important to understand that their disappearing act is not about punishing you. It's not about manipulating you. It's about self-preservation. In fact, that moment of deep connection probably stirred something in them they didn't expect. They may have felt love or admiration, or the terrifying realization that they are, in fact, getting attached. And because avoidants are used to operating in emotional detachment, this realization hits them like a tidal wave. They don't have the internal tools to sit in that emotion, process it, and move forward with closeness, so they hit the brakes. Hard. Another reason avoidants disappear after closeness is because their subconscious mind is scanning for danger. Somewhere in their memory, connection led to pain. Maybe they opened up to a parent or caregiver and were dismissed, ridiculed, or emotionally abandoned. Maybe their emotional needs were unmet for so long that they learned to equate closeness with disappointment. So when you show up in a genuine, consistent, loving way, it clashes with the narrative they've lived for years. Instead of embracing it, they reject it. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because they don't yet believe that safe love exists. Their disappearance is a reset, a way to create distance so they can regain control of their emotions, convince themselves they're not too attached, and recalibrate the relationship back to a level of comfort they can tolerate. What makes this all so complicated is that avoidants rarely explain what's happening. They don't send a text saying, "Hey, I'm feeling overwhelmed with emotions and need space." That would be too vulnerable, too exposed. Instead, they vanish quietly, hoping the silence will buy them the time and space they need to self-regulate. But for you, the silence feels like abandonment, and that's where things start to spiral. You may reach out more, overthink, become hypervigilant, or start chasing them emotionally. And in doing so, you unknowingly confirm their fears that intimacy means pressure, suffocation, or loss of self. It's a vicious cycle, one that repeats over and over unless one or both partners learn to recognize what's really going on underneath the surface. When avoidants disappear after connection, it's not your fault. It's not about your worth, your attractiveness, or your value in the relationship. It's about the fact that you've touched something tender in them and they're not ready to face it yet. They love in silence. They process in solitude. They heal in hiding. But that doesn't mean the connection wasn't real. It means the connection was so real that it woke up something in them they weren't prepared to feel. Avoidant partners often try to control the pace of a relationship not because they're heartless or manipulative, but because emotional closeness triggers an inner alarm they don't fully understand. When they start to feel something real, when the stakes get higher, when the connection becomes undeniable, that's when they start to pull the reins tighter. You may feel the difference immediately. 1 week, things are flowing. You're spending more time together, there's a natural ease, and conversations deepen. Then all of a sudden, they suggest taking things slow. They talk about needing space, time, or wanting to see where this goes. It can feel like emotional whiplash. But to someone with avoidant tendencies, intimacy without control feels like free-falling, and their way of surviving that fear is to grab hold of the brakes. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, love doesn't arrive as a gentle unfolding. It shows up as intensity. It hijacks their nervous system. They start to feel vulnerable, which they have been trained, consciously or unconsciously, to associate with danger. So the first thing they do is try to regulate the speed of the connection, not because they aren't interested, but because they are, deeply. And that level of emotional investment feels like a threat to their independence, identity, and sense of control. So what do? They start limiting the time spent together. They push for fewer commitments. They avoid labels. They turn what could be a flowing, organic bond into a stop-start dynamic designed to help them breathe. What they don't realize is that this controlling of pace doesn't just buy them space. It creates insecurity in you, their partner. The emotional tug-of-war begins here. You sense their hesitation, and your instinct may be to lean in, to reassure them, to close the gap. But every time you try to move closer, they lean out just a little more. That's because avoidants perceive emotional closeness as something they have to survive rather than enjoy. When you try to speed up the connection or seek clarity about where things are headed, they interpret that as pressure. And when they feel pressure, their walls go up. This doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means they're falling back into the only pattern that's ever felt safe, retreating into emotional distance. Controlling the pace is their way of avoiding vulnerability. They might claim they want something slow and steady, but what they really mean is, I want something I can regulate emotionally without feeling exposed. That's a very different thing. They don't just want to take it slow. They need to in order to keep themselves from feeling overwhelmed. You might hear them say things like, let's not rush into anything, or I like you, but I don't want to label this yet. And here's the trap. Those phrases sound reasonable. Of course, pacing is important in any relationship, but when an avoidant uses pace as a shield, they're not just moving slowly, they're controlling access to their heart. They're deciding how much love they can tolerate. They're managing you like you're a threat to their internal safety system. You'll know they're trying to control the pace when you feel like the relationship only moves forward when they say it can. You want to see them more often? They say they're busy. You bring up the idea of exclusivity. They say, let's not put labels on this. You ask where the relationship is going. They respond with ambiguity. This isn't because they lack interest. It's because they're terrified of losing control. And losing control for them is equivalent to losing themselves. Many avoidants grew up in environments where emotions were either unsafe or dismissed. So as adults, they try to control relationships to avoid repeating that chaos. The problem is, real love isn't something you can micromanage. It requires surrender, trust, and that terrifies them. What hurts the most is that when they try to control the pace, you're the one who feels destabilized. You're the one questioning your worth, wondering if you're too much, trying to decode mixed signals. But in reality, their need to control the pace says more about their internal fear than it does about your value in their life. They're not pulling back because they want to lose you. They're pulling back because they're already in deep. And that depth is waking up every old fear they thought they had buried. Their heart may be opening, but their reflex is to keep the door barely cracked. So they set rules, they space things out, they put guardrails on something that's supposed to be expansive and free, and to them that feels like love at a pace they can handle. When you're in a relationship with someone who leans avoidant, it's easy to overlook the small, subtle signs that they care deeply. You're probably expecting grand gestures, open vulnerability, or verbal affirmations, the kind of behaviors we've been taught to associate with love. But that's not how an avoidant partner operates. They don't love loudly, they love quietly through the side door. They're not going to shower you with emotional words or cling to you with obvious displays of affection. What they do instead is show up in consistent, almost imperceptible ways that reveal just how invested they really are. The problem is, if you don't understand how they express affection, you might miss it altogether, and worse, you might assume they don't care. Avoidant partners are often terrified of needing someone. They were raised to value self-sufficiency and emotional independence above all else, and the very idea of relying on another person can trigger fear, shame, or even panic. So when they start to care, when they begin to develop real emotional attachment, they don't declare it, they protect it, they guard it, and they express it in ways that feel safe to them. That means they'll often choose action over words, logistics over emotions, and consistency over intensity. They'll remember your coffee order. They'll pick you up when your car breaks down. They'll fix something in your apartment without you asking. They won't say, "I love you" easily, but they'll remember what movie you wanted to watch, and they'll make sure it's queued up when you arrive. This is how they show up, not with fireworks, but with fingerprints on the smallest, most stable parts of your daily life. This subtle form of showing up can feel emotionally confusing if you're used to a more expressive kind of love. You might be waiting for a text that says, "I miss you," while they're quietly researching the best way to help you with your upcoming job interview. You might be craving a long phone call while they're silently making sure your favorite snack is stocked at their place. To them, love means being useful, dependable, and steady. Not needy, not emotionally overwhelming. They fear being too much, and they fear being engulfed. So instead of leaning in with emotional vulnerability, they anchor themselves by becoming dependable in small but meaningful ways. They build safety through structure, not sentiment. And this is why it's so important to stop measuring love by intensity alone. Intensity fades, drama burns out. But consistency, especially from someone who's afraid of closeness, is a radical form of commitment. If an avoidant is consistently checking in, even with simple messages like, "How's your day?" or "Let me know when you get home safe," they are opening up in the only way they know how. Every time they respond quickly to a need or take care of something for you without making a big deal about it, they're saying, "I'm here and I'm paying attention." It may not come with flowery language, but it is layered with meaning, especially for someone whose instinct is usually to pull away. You may also notice that avoidants don't make a lot of promises, but the ones they do make, they keep. That's because they're not comfortable with making commitments they can't deliver on. They would rather underpromise and overdeliver than say something emotionally loaded and not follow through. So when they offer to do something for you and they follow through every time, that's love in action. It's their way of proving to you and to themselves that they can show up without losing themselves, that they can care without becoming consumed. And this slow, steady participation in your life, it's trust being built brick by brick. Another subtle way avoidants show up is by letting you into their routines. If they invite you into their quiet world, even if it's not romantic or dramatic, pay attention. Being asked to join them on errands, being introduced to the people they trust, being shown their creative projects or hobbies, all of that is sacred to them. It might look ordinary, but to someone who values emotional space and internal privacy, sharing their time, their routines, and their personal world is a massive sign of connection. They're letting you see who they really are in the background, without the mask. That is intimacy for them, not through big declarations, but through integration into their real, unscripted life. To the outside world, or even to someone with an anxious attachment style, all of this might seem insufficient. It might feel too quiet, too neutral, too lacking in emotional depth. But when an avoidant starts making you a part of their daily life, when they show up regularly in small ways, when they keep their word and respond to your needs without you begging for it, that is their version of being all in. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in dating someone with an avoidant attachment style is how their anxiety gets misread as disinterest. We expect avoidance to look like coldness, silence, or apathy. But what if I told you that sometimes the most obvious sign that an avoidant is falling for you is that they seem anxious around you, not distant? Their behavior becomes fidgety, inconsistent, awkward even. And it's easy to misinterpret that unease as boredom or emotional detachment. But in truth, what you're witnessing is internal chaos. Their brain is working overtime. Their body is on edge. Their walls are clashing with their heart. And while they may not say it outright, their nervous energy around you is a sign that something real is unfolding inside them, and it terrifies them. Avoidantly attached individuals are wired to stay in control of their emotions, their space, their image, and most importantly, their vulnerability. Emotional closeness threatens all of that. When they start to care about someone, their entire inner world becomes unstable. Suddenly, they're not just navigating a relationship, they're managing risk. Risk of being seen, risk of being dependent, risk of being hurt. So they start to act strange, not because they're uninterested, but because they're deeply conflicted. They want connection, but they're afraid of what it means. Their anxiety is not a reflection of who you are or what you've done. It's a mirror of their internal struggle between the desire to connect and the instinct to self-protect. You'll notice it in subtle but obvious ways. Their eye contact might become inconsistent. They'll say something heartfelt and then make a sarcastic joke to deflect from the emotion. They may seem nervous when plans feel too romantic or relationship-y, even if they initiated those very plans. Sometimes they'll seem irritated for no reason, like your presence is both soothing and overstimulating all at once. And you're left wondering, what did I do? But it's not about you. It's about their fight with closeness. Emotional intimacy activates a part of their brain that warns, this is unsafe, even when nothing threatening is actually happening. So they try to regulate their discomfort, but it leaks out through behaviors that seem like defensiveness, restlessness, or emotional volatility. Many avoidants experience this anxiety somatically. Their body language shifts around people they're developing feelings for. They might suddenly avoid physical touch when it used to feel natural. They might get tongue-tied during meaningful conversations, or abruptly change the subject when the moment starts to feel too intimate. You might notice them becoming short-tempered or distracted, not because their interest is fading, but because their emotional bandwidth is maxed out. They're trying to stay connected and distant at the same time, and that internal tug of war shows up as visible unease. It's not calculated. It's not manipulation. It's a survival strategy rooted in early experiences where closeness equaled vulnerability and vulnerability equaled pain. What's especially confusing is that their anxiety can mimic the exact behaviors you associate with rejection: the pullback, the guarded tone, the avoidance of eye contact or future plans. But under the surface, this behavior is often fueled by care. The more they like you, the more dysregulated they feel. Their independence is being challenged. Their emotional boundaries are being tested. Their sense of self is being reshaped. And that kind of emotional transformation isn't smooth. It's messy, clumsy, and filled with self-doubt. So they fumble, they push and pull, they act hot and cold, not because they're playing games, but because they don't know how to stay emotionally open without feeling consumed. If you pay attention, their anxiety around you can be incredibly revealing. It shows that you matter. It shows that they're emotionally activated, and while they may not have the skills to communicate it directly, their nervousness is saying, "This connection is real, and I don't know how to handle it yet." They might over-explain themselves or try too hard to seem chill. They might replay conversations in their head afterward, wondering if they came off too emotional, too aloof, too interested. They're not detached. They're hyper-aware. And that hyper-awareness turns ordinary moments into emotional landmines for them, even if they don't show it clearly. Understanding this pattern helps you stop taking their anxious behavior personally. It allows you to see that their guardedness isn't proof of absence. It's proof of struggle. The nervous energy, the inconsistent reactions, the moments where they seem distant when things get emotional, those are all expressions of their internal conflict. Because underneath the walls, underneath the silence, underneath the tension, they're starting to feel something they can't easily control. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, that's the scariest and most significant experience of all. When someone with an avoidant attachment style begins to experience emotional vulnerability, their instinct is not to lean in. It's to look away, literally. And often the most telling sign that something meaningful is happening beneath the surface is their refusal to meet your gaze. Eye contact for them is more than a social cue. It's an exposure, a spotlight, a mirror they're not ready to look into. When an avoidant starts to feel something real, when they're flooded with emotion, empathy, guilt, affection, or even the first signs of love, they break eye contact. And if you don't understand this behavior, you might assume the worst. You might think they're hiding something, being dishonest, disinterested, or emotionally checked out. But in truth, their inability to meet your eyes is often the most raw and honest moment you'll witness. Because that break in connection, that sudden glance away, that long stare at the floor or at their hands, it's not avoidance of you. It's avoidance of the vulnerability they're feeling in real time. For someone who's wired to protect themselves emotionally, eye contact is threatening. It invites presence. It signals, "I see you," and more terrifyingly, "you see me." And avoidant individuals have spent most of their emotional lives building careful defenses so that no one ever truly sees them. Not their fears, not their wounds, not their hunger for love, not their fragility. So when they're in a situation where they feel exposed, maybe you've just said something kind or asked a deep question or touched on a subject close to their heart, their first impulse is to look away. not because they're trying to escape the conversation, but because direct eye contact feels like too much intimacy too fast. It collapses their emotional boundaries in a way they're not prepared to tolerate. You'll notice it in conversations where things get real. When you talk about your feelings, when you say, "I care about you," or "this meant a lot to me," and they suddenly look down, when they're apologizing and their eyes keep darting to the side, when they're trying to express something difficult but can't hold your gaze long enough to say it. These are the moments where their defenses are fraying. You're touching the soft, unguarded parts of them that they don't know how to share. Looking away isn't them being cold. It's them managing emotional intensity in the only way they know how, by retreating into physical cues that help them feel less exposed. Avoidant individuals often learned at a young age that emotional visibility was risky. Maybe they were punished or rejected for expressing sadness or fear. Maybe they were met with indifference when they tried to show affection or seek reassurance. Over time, they developed the belief that emotions are a liability, that to be seen is to be judged or abandoned. So they learned to internalize their feelings, to speak less, and to distance themselves when emotions run high. And eye contact? That's one of the most emotionally vulnerable acts a person can engage in. It creates instant connection. It removes the mask. It invites intimacy. And for someone who's spent years avoiding emotional dependency, it can feel like standing naked in the middle of a crowded room. This behavior isn't just psychological, it's physiological. When an avoidant person experiences stress or vulnerability, their nervous system kicks into high alert. Their heart rate increases, their breathing changes, their brain starts scanning for safety. And one of the fastest ways to reduce internal overwhelm is to break eye contact. Looking away helps them self-soothe. It allows them to retreat just enough to stay present without completely shutting down. It's not that they don't want to be connected, it's that they're trying to regulate themselves in order to stay connected without spiraling. That glance to the floor or to the window isn't rejection, it's survival. It's their nervous system saying, "This is too much, too fast, I need a second." The more emotionally invested they become, the more this pattern can surface. And ironically, the deeper the connection, the harder it becomes for them to maintain eye contact in meaningful moments. You might expect that love would soften them, that it would make them more open, more expressive. But for avoidance, love increases vulnerability, which increases the urge to protect. So when you say something heartfelt and they look away, when you try to hold their gaze during an emotional conversation and they fidget or retreat, understand what's really happening. Their body is betraying how much they care. Their eyes are saying what their words can't. Because to lock eyes with someone who sees you deeply is to admit that you're affected, that you're emotionally involved, that you've let someone into a space you swore you'd keep guarded. And for someone who has spent their life believing they have to be emotionally self-sufficient, that moment of silent eye contact is the most dangerous kind of intimacy. It's not that they can't feel, it's that feeling, and being seen while they feel shakes the very foundation they've built to keep themselves safe. So they glance away, they shift in their seat, they study their hands, and in that moment, they're not avoiding you. They're avoiding the magnitude of what they're feeling for you. When you're in a relationship with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, the push-pull dynamic can be absolutely maddening. One moment they're close, maybe even tender, attentive, open. Then suddenly something shifts. They withdraw. They create distance. They stop responding with the same warmth, and they start guarding their time, their space, and their emotions like something sacred they're terrified to lose. And just when you begin to adjust to the distance, just when you've started telling yourself to detach, move on, let it go, they come back. Sometimes with a casual message, sometimes with full force, sometimes pretending nothing ever happened, but they return. And to understand what that return truly means, You have to understand the psychological storm that pulls them away in the first place, and what compels them to come back again and again. Avoidant individuals are deeply conflicted when it comes to love. On the surface, they seem composed, independent, and unaffected. But beneath that exterior is a fragile emotional system that doesn't know how to stay steady in the face of vulnerability. Connection feels good to them, yes, but only to a point. Beyond that point, it feels dangerous. It threatens their autonomy. It invites dependency. It calls into question the very identity they've built around not needing anyone. So when the emotional intimacy in a relationship starts to deepen, when they feel seen or relied upon or emotionally close, they instinctively pull away. It's not punishment. It's not cruelty. It's defense. They retreat because closeness activates an ancient wound inside them that says, if you let someone get too close, they will either hurt you, expect too much from you, or make you lose yourself. But the pulling away is not the end of the story. In fact, what often confuses partners the most is the return, because the return always comes. Sometimes it's a day later. Sometimes it's a week or a month. But they circle back, not because they're bored, not because they're playing games, but because their feelings never actually disappeared. What faded was their ability to tolerate those feelings in the moment. They needed distance not because they didn't care, but because they cared so deeply that they felt overwhelmed by the emotional exposure. They disconnect to recalibrate. And once their system feels safe again, once the intensity has dulled down, they reemerge. The connection they feared still exists. The attachment they tried to outrun is still pulling on them. And so they come back, not as a manipulator, but as a person trying to love in a way that doesn't drown them. This coming back is one of the clearest signs that you matter to them. Avoidants don't return to just anyone. In fact, it's easier for them to walk away from relationships that feel surface level or emotionally safe because there's no real vulnerability involved. But when they return to you, especially after pulling away, it's because something inside them can't fully disconnect. They've tried. They've rationalized. They've reminded themselves of all the reasons why being close is scary. And still, something stronger pulls them back, something they're not used to honoring but can't seem to ignore. Their return is not just a matter of habit. It's a silent admission that the bond remains even if they're not yet ready to fully surrender to it. What's important to recognize is that avoidants often don't explain their withdrawal or their return. They might come back with a neutral message, "Hey, how have you been?" or "I was just thinking about you." It may not be accompanied by any deep apology or explanation, but that doesn't mean it lacks meaning. For someone who struggles with emotional openness, even reaching out again is a significant step. It's a sign they've been thinking, processing, perhaps regretting, and wondering if the door is still open. Their communication may be cautious, indirect, or emotionally muted, but behind the restraint is a heart that's quietly asking, "Is it safe for me to try again?" It's also worth noting that their return is often accompanied by subtle behavioral shifts. They may show up with slightly more presence than before. They may try harder to meet your needs, even if imperfectly. They may test the waters to see how much vulnerability they can handle without losing themselves. The growth is slow and sometimes frustrating, but it's there. Their return is not just physical, it's emotional too, even if it doesn't look like a grand gesture. It's their way of saying, "I'm still here, I'm still connected, I'm still trying to figure this out." And for someone with a fear of intimacy, that act of returning, of re-engaging with the very thing that overwhelms them, is not a sign of weakness. It's a quiet form of bravery. Look, love from an avoidant doesn't show up in predictable packaging. You have to read between the lines, not out of desperation, but out of awareness. They're not broken. They're scared, and when you understand what their distance really means, you stop reacting and you start leading with strength, clarity, and self-respect. You don't need to chase them. You need to understand them and decide if their version of love is the one that truly honors yours.